Good morning, everyone. Wow, what an amazing morning it is today. Quite a contrast. I remember arriving here last year at last year's conference, and I was so excited. I got in the plane, and it was the first time I'd been in an airport for 2 years, and I was like, wow, this is going to be so exciting. Of course, the flight's delayed for 7.5 hours, so I'm like, oh, I remember what it used to be like. And when I finally arrived here, welcome to Houston. So great to get to some other place besides my office at home. I'm welcomed by a hurricane, right? And so I arrive in the middle of a hurricane, and that was exciting. Hadn't been one of those for a while. But got out of my hotel this morning. What a beautiful, glorious day. And thank you so much to the Energy Conference Network and our colleagues from Blockchain for Energy for inviting me to share some ideas and perspectives with you from kind of a global perspective. The Blockchain Research Institute is the world's leading independent think tank on Web3 and blockchain technology and how it impacts business, industry, society, governments. And we basically are an accelerator. We kind of run around the world sprinkling pixie dust and accelerating conversations because we're quite convinced that there is something very big and important and fundamental that is happening. We're getting access to a new kind of information technology infrastructure that has the potential of being enormously transformative. And the oil and gas industry is one of the industries, like all industries, that are going to be significantly impacted, and it is an industry under transition. It's an exciting time. This is about a $6 trillion industry globally, and it is growing at a huge CAGR. There's obviously all kinds of, that's right, I've got a little device here that advances things, don't I? There we are. There's all kinds of pressures that are impacting the industry, ranging from various different shocks to the supply chain stability to, of course, instabilities in many of the global economies and wars and the like, as well as a lot of regulatory and environmental constraints that are just realities that we have to deal with and are going to become increasingly pressing. So there's a lot of kind of demand pull for a lot of change in the industry, and change is difficult, especially in very well-established industries that have huge investments in existing infrastructure. So that's kind of the overall landscape. There's a lot of stuff going on. So the question is, okay, what is the new reality in which we can form strategic goals? Well, something very important is happening. Obviously, the internet itself, the idea of a global information infrastructure, is a very powerful construct that is kind of foundational and fundamental to many things. But it was designed with a bit of an original sin. It was specifically designed to exclude the possibility of conducting commerce, and it never incorporated the concept of ownership. It was really fundamentally, initially, just a read medium that was used to publish information. And then, of course, in the early 2000s through mid-2010s, it became a social internet where people both read and wrote, and started to kind of share content. The big thing that's happening now is that we're developing and maturing that technology and incorporating a new capability around ownership. And ownership is a really powerful fundamental construct. The idea that you can enforce digital scarcity allows you to build new kinds of economies. So what's happening is we're seeing the emergence of Web3. And I should just say up front that kind of my goal here is kind of threefold. I get the envious task of kind of establishing a context for the rest of this conference to talk about some of the big ideas, the big concepts. And then I'm going to tell a story in 3 chapters about how I think it's impacting this particular industry. So at the top level, we've got the emergence of Web3, which fundamentally is the combination of 4 core technologies. It's the advent of prediction as a service, the idea that we're going to be able to have authoritative prediction as part of every business process. Just because we have access to vast sums of data, we've got advanced artificial intelligence engines that will allow us to be able to assess risk in a real-time dynamic kind of way and to make predictions, and that's going to inform a lot of our process our processes and our strategy. The second big thing is measurement. And IoT is really quite transformative, especially in this industry. The ability to count and to measure and to have a confidence in what's going on in the real world and be able to establish digital twins of those real world assets is a really big, powerful kind of construct. There is an emerging area around the spatial internet of visualization, and this is an interesting area of being able to augment reality and to immerse ourselves into virtual realities and use these spatial constructs as means of working together, interacting with real world systems. And then fundamentally, the foundation of this is the blockchain, and that is the new operating system. It is a state engine. It allows us to have confidence in our collective view of what the truth is around data and confidence in the collective shared business logic that underlines multi-party processes. It's a trust protocol, and trust is a very, very powerful fundamental primitive that will allow much smaller economic actors to combine their capabilities, resources, goods, and services into composite goods and services and deliver them to the marketplace and leverage this new technology in such a way that allows these ecosystems to behave like big coordinated corporations. And that's a pretty significant evolution in the structure of business. It has many advantages that, of course, the very fact that you're here, many of you are, all of you are probably very familiar with it. It's decentralized, distributed, it's entirely verifiable, which has some important implications with respect to auditing and regulatory compliance. It's very, very composable. Spend a bit more time on composability in a few seconds. It's trustless, that you don't need to have a third party that is owning and has the responsibility and the ownership of the state of things, that is to say, the remembrance of what happened, who transacted, when, what, for how much. It can be very self-governing, and that allows for stability in terms of investing in the ecosystem. And it permits us access to digital assets. The concept of state that I just mentioned is really a very important idea. In the traditional world that we've been living in, state has been owned by private companies, by our banks, by our governments, by platform companies like Facebook and Google and Apple. And governance around that state has been centralized. And as a result, those platforms, the state owners, have been largely the beneficiaries of a lot of the value created around this space. And this control of the state has created many trillions of dollars worth of new value, new wealth. The question becomes, when the state responsibility becomes an inherent characteristic of the underlying network, that it no longer resides and is controlled by private companies, what kinds of new economic activity, what kinds of new innovation, what kinds of new investment become possible? Governance becomes much more stable and much more decentralized, allowing de-risking of investments into the space, and the benefits and the wealth creation get much more equitably distributed across the ecosystem. So these are some of the big business constructs that we see emerging in the Web3 space. One of the most important things that this enables is a new emergence of a new kind of economy. You know, we think about the huge numbers of transactions that are currently going on in the world. And most of those transactions are person-to-person, person-to-business, business-to-business kinds of transactions. And yes, they are large. There's this hundreds of thousands, millions of transactions per day. But in a world with literally billions of IoT devices and sensors that are communicating with each other and making local decisions about conditions. I mean, just look at some of the latest generation of electric vehicles. They're mobile sensing, AI-driven platforms that are making local decisions about, you know, what to do and how to do it. Those are all machine-to-machine transactions. In the machine-to-machine world, the transaction volumes are absolutely unbelievably large. And in that environment, there first of all has to be a huge amount of automation, but second of all, a significant amount of trust between all of those discrete entities. And so this world needs to be coordinated, and of course the blockchain operating system is the way that that's happening. So that's kind of an interesting thing. along with this kind of fundamental infrastructure, and I should kind of press the point that this isn't technically speaking a disruptive technology, this is a foundational technology, and we only see these things come around once in a generation. But along with that foundational technology that I've been alluding to, we get access to these very powerful primitives. These are the building blocks. This is the reason that Lego is such a great tool. You know, yes, you can buy a Lego set and you can kind of build the Death Star per the instructions, but then you can integrate that with an ecosystem of other Star Wars things, or in fact, bring in hospitals and trucks and horses or anything that you want to and compose them in different configurations. So these are the basic building blocks. Digital assets, smart contracts, the concept of trust is a fundamental primitive, and of course the resilience of a decentralized distributed network are the world that we're now living in. So that's kind of the basic building blocks. So I said I'd tell the story in 3 chapters. The first chapter really is the low-hanging fruit, and that is to say that there just are, as with any new technology, a group of use cases that you can kind of evaluate a new technology against and say, does this new technology allow me to do something that is 10% cheaper, 10% better, 10% faster? And that is a systematic analysis that we should all do whenever a new technology comes out, and look if there's any better ways of doing the stuff that we do that gives us cost, quality, and time advantages in the marketplace. And at last year's conference, we talked about 10 of these things, and we kind of went through and described each one, and we talked about companies around the world that were in production or in pilot on these various different areas. And they're ones that a lot of you are familiar with. There are use cases here that many exhibitors in the adjacent room are talking about. And they're really about, rebuilding a very broken supply chain world and series of processes that most of us are just all too familiar with. Re-engineering processes right across the entire up, mid, and downstreams, tracking carbon, coordinating contracts between partners, assuring land and royalty rights, and the registries around those assets, digitizing post-trade settlements, streamlining regulatory compliance, improving maintenance inspections, embracing crypto and a new payment stream or payment rail, and transitioning to next generation industry and diversifying. So those were kind of the ones that we went through last year. We actually published a report on this that I actually authored, and we published this a few months ago that looks at all those various different use cases and a lot of the examples in the industry that are out there of companies implementing these various different use cases. And they really are impacting all life cycle phases. So the implications of these Web3 technologies is really quite pervasive and quite transformative. And I think that we should use that kind of lens to look at them. There are lots of companies in the world that are doing some really interesting implementations of these various different technologies. So this is kind of real stuff, and this is, of course, just a very small sampling of those companies. I thought I'd add three other kind of elaborations on top of that list. And because, well, first of all, I think they're important, and second of all, they're emerging, and people are starting to do real work around this space. The first is around sustainability and green energy, and I'm going to spend a little more time on this in a second. But this, of course, is a really big, important deal, and we're starting to see just how big it is. And being able to track and trace and know where stuff is, carbon credits. I had a great conversation with one of our colleagues last night around the importance of granularity in this space and the confidence in granular measurements, transparency, and energy provenance, all kind of essential items, or issues, whether it's conformance to some sort of regulatory mandate or governmental trade policy or embargo or responding to a natural disaster or an industrial disaster. These are all kind of fundamental issues that the blockchain allows us as an industry to address. And there's some really interesting examples out there that I'll be here for the next 2 days. We can talk about them in a little more detail. Another interesting one that kind of caught my attention is around sustainable aviation fuel. and the establishment of book and claim systems. There's a fascinating system that's been built by Accenture and Shell and Amex Global Business Travel that really kind of separate the physicality of fuel systems in the aviation industry and the digital aspect. So there are companies that have environmental goals, corporate mandates, and or customers that are demanding certain kinds of mixes and uses of various different kinds of renewable fuels. But then the simple logistic problem that you might have an airplane in a particular airport in a particular location in the world that doesn't actually have the infrastructure to supply that. So by divorcing the physical world from the digital world, they can in effect consume virtually that alternative bio-aviation fuel, and that it becomes an offset to someone that actually is consuming it somewhere else that isn't claiming it. And so you basically have the system-wide impact of delivering on those mandates, but great flexibility on the physicality of delivering on those mandates. And so that becomes a really interesting tool. And that system kind of caught my eye as being an interesting illustration of the potential of digital twins. And digital twins becomes another important concept in this one. And this is all about the life cycle of tracking parts and maintenance. This is a big deal for, first of all, inventory and supply chain and maintenance and regulatory conformance reasons. But it also is important for protecting against the introduction of sub-quality or counterfeit parts into systems. One of our members is involved in supplying parts to the aviation industry. There's a huge issue about fraudulent parts ending up inside of the turbines that power airplanes. And that, of course, is a serious problem because they don't have the same kind of quality control and regulatory inspection over them, and it becomes a pretty significant safety issue. But the same is true in a lot of our refineries or natural gas pipeline infrastructures, and the consequences of failure are very substantial, right? They can lead to, first of all, a lot of environmental impact, potential fines from government, large costs involved in downtime, as well as the maintenance to fix it, as well as reputational damage to the company. So the ability to leverage digital twinning is just a very fundamental construct in this whole area of maintenance and parts tracking. So I just thought those were interesting, and there's actually I think it was Shell again that was involved in a very interesting project right now that is implementing this not only across their own company, but across all the affiliates that they interact with, to make sure that as their systems interact with adjacent systems, that they have an understanding of what parts are where and what the maintenance record is on any given part, when it was last serviced, and all that sort of information, and it's quite transformative. So the second chapter of this story is really about digital assets. And those three examples that I called out were all examples of the potential of digital assets. And a lot of people are there's a lot of confusion in the industry, or actually in the world, around what digital assets are. A lot of people immediately go to cryptocurrencies or crypto bearer assets like Bitcoin. But digital assets are much, much, much greater than that. Those are only one of the archetypes of digital assets. There's 9 fundamental archetypes of digital assets, of which cryptocurrencies, digital money are only one of them, and even there's a few different subgroupings of them. Governance tokens, the ability to allow distributed people to make decisions together and to make predictions together, are a very powerful construct. Various different kinds of exchange tokens that allow systems to actually talk to each other and to interface and to translate value, stable coins, and in the oil and gas industry, there's even a lot of talk about using an oil-pegged stable coin, either as a medium of exchange inside of the industry itself, or more broadly speaking, as a way of having a reliable, consistent valuation of a bearer asset in the marketplace. And so that is that's an interesting concept. Central bank digital currencies, of course, are really changed the landscape in terms of what reserve currencies are, and that's going to impact this industry considerably because of its international dimensions. The emergence of various different protocol tokens that support the infrastructure that's running this next generation of the internet. Non-fungible tokens aren't just, bit maps of apes and stuff. They are things like digital identities. They are digital twins of a particular part in a particular place. I'm doing a lot of work with the spirits and the wine and spirits industry right now, and there's just massive introduction of fraudulent spirits and wine into the industry, and they're actually twinning individual bottles so that you can tap your phone to it and actually track what grapes in what vineyard they were harvested from, exactly what date they were pressed and fermented, and how it was moved through the entire world to ensure that it's in fact the right kind of, that you're actually consuming the real product. Securities tokens to establish ownership and fractional ownership, which I'll talk about in a second, and of course natural asset tokens to deal with things like with carbon tracing and green energy. It's become, on that topic, on the green, on the carbon impact topic, this is maybe the most important issue facing the industry. I took an Uber to the airport yesterday, and my driver was recently arrived in Canada from Pakistan, and we got into a big discussion about the complete tragedy that's besought that country. A third of the country is underwater. Can you imagine what would happen if a third of the United States was underwater? I mean, the human tragedy and the food crisis that will emerge out of that is just almost too great to comprehend. And the reality is that this is going to be driving, well, first of all, it's going to be driving a big question about reparations and about who actually pays for that, and what the response is from the rest of the world. That, how do we, take on whatever responsibility we bear to help them out, not only as fellow human beings, but as people that in some way are responsible for what's going on there. So I think it becomes a big political issue, and this really becomes a forcing function, and flooding is only one attribute of the climate crisis, but that provides the background for this carbon imperative. And there's a lot of drivers for the carbon imperative. Of course, the crisis itself is a big issue. It's driving a transition in the industry, right? I think most of us understand that we are watching an industry that will be in transition over the next 20 years. It's an essential and important industry, but it has to be in transition for a whole bunch of reasons. There are changing consumer demands. There's lots of taxation and regulation coming in to affect this. There's also implications of brand value, right? So, one of the issues that we're seeing right now is a lot of activist investors that are, bringing the collective investor, want for change and for dealing with this crisis to the boardrooms of all of our companies. And they reflect a lot of the consumer demand as well. And so these are very significant issues, and it's manifests itself. I had a discussion with a counsel from one of the big energy companies last week, and we were talking about some of the lawsuits that various different attorneys generals are bringing against companies that arguably are in service of a political agenda to, stand up to big oil. And in some way they're a nuisance, and of course the industry, wins all of the cases on technicalities. But not only is it a nuisance and there's some legal exposure, but more importantly there's a brand value exposure, and which is very substantial. And so that's part of the backdrop. And I think that it really behooves us, and I know there's going to be a number of presentations around this topic during the rest of this conference, that kind of goes to this core question of, we need to find a way to measure and to track and to have a degree of transparency and to partner with regulators in a constructive way to understand the ebbs and flows of the carbon content and the carbon impact of the industry, and to have various different corporate mandates. There's a lot of talk about net zero and about the transition to a much more balanced ecology, and figure out how we, in fact, offset the impact and minimize the impact that the carbon is having. And there are a number of solutions for them, for this. And I think I'm going to focus on kind of two parts of this equation, right? And the first part is quite fundamental, and that's confidence. And confidence in the underlying data, the ability to, first of all, measure it and have, enough auditing, trusted scrutiny over the kind of the sourcing and the initial counting of things, but then the ability to ledger that content and to be able to trade it and make sure that there isn't double counting and that greenwashing is pretty transparent and can be exposed pretty easily, that we have mechanisms to deal with a continuum of carbon impact issues, ranging from on the carbon offset side, from actual carbon removal from the atmosphere, kind of at one extreme, to the, I will promise not to cut down swaths of rainforest in Brazil in exchange for, carbon credits. There's a continuum of what the quality of a carbon credit is on the one side of the equation. And the other side, there is this issue of, can we actually count and measure things confidently in an authoritative way and ledger it in a way that stands up to scrutiny, that the public and the regulators have confidence in, and that we as an industry can figure out what the ebbs and flows and the balances are, so that we can collectively approach this very real problem in a very constructive way. The second part of that equation is that once that happens, we allow ourselves to have a marketplace, right? Once you've got data and assets, digital assets, and you have collective confidence in those assets, it allows us to actually have a real marketplace around these things. And the marketplace today is first of all very large. I think it's like $678 billion marketplace for carbon credits, which is quite large. But the vast majority of that is institutional, right? Only a tiny slice, less than $1 billion of that is the individual investor access to that marketplace. And we have a chance to change that. One of the really powerful ideas behind digital assets is it allows for very efficient fractional ownership, right? The barrier to entry of being engaged and involved in a particular marketplace, think of the real estate marketplace, right? If you want to participate in the real estate marketplace, traditionally you've had to have at least enough capital to buy a house. And then, of course, to deal with the cost structure of managing it and renting it and marketing it and all that kind of stuff. But in the fractional ownership world, and REITs are one example, but we're now getting into various different crowdfunding models enabled by this digital asset world, where individuals can participate in a much more granular way. And so that becomes a really interesting potential. And I think that as we think about how to develop this marketplace, that this idea of leveraging fractional ownership has to be part of that equation. And the last big concept is really about composability. And in many ways, this is the most important one. It's always been about composability, right? Back in the mid-1500s, there was two new decentralized technologies introduced. One was the permissionless communication protocol, the printing press, and the other one was the codification of assets, the development of ledger-based double entry accounting. They led to a massive explosion in value creation and economic expansion, starting with the Renaissance, moving into the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and ultimately the first industrial revolution. And the growth of economic value was absolutely extraordinary. And that's the same kind of thing that we're seeing today. The crypto market's actually a good example. It's grown from 10 to $250 billion in a matter of 2 years. Absolutely unprecedented growth. And the reason for that, along all these different services, has been that this is a very composable environment. It has very strong collective governance that de-risks investment. It has high degrees of standardization that allows for different systems to be composed in different configurations. And a lot of these services are actually adjacent to a lot of the processes that this industry is engaged in. And so this concept of composability in this new world is one of the biggest, most important ideas. So what are the imperatives? Number one, going out and just figuring out where this new technology can be applied against existing processes to create new kinds of values where it makes sense. Number two, investing in carbon initiatives. It's going to happen. The public, the government, everyone's demanding this. This has to be one of the highest priorities. Number three, leveraging the technology that the DeFi industry has invented. Right? If the DeFi industry went completely disappeared tomorrow, the amount of money and the amount of smart people that have built extraordinary systems is a vast, vast investment in a whole bunch of new technology that can be leveraged. And there's really good stuff just sitting on the shelf that's a subsidy. Number four, engaging stakeholders to develop ecosystems. No one company is going to be able to chart their way through this transition to deal with all of the flux that's out there and deal with the carbon credit by themselves. This has to be an ecosystem activity, and that's why organizations like Blockchain for Energy are so important to this world. Explore co-investment opportunities with those ecosystem and partners to combine the investment and the creative and engineering skills that you collectively have to solve these big problems. Prepare services for composability. As you're building new services, always think about composability, right? How will this system be composed with other systems? It has to be a core design construct. Number seven, build a center of excellence, because having a core group of people that really understand this, that are in the flow, that you can leverage as a resource, and then when the time comes that this becomes much more pervasive, you can take them and spread them out and distribute them through the organization. And that really kind of goes to staying in the flow. Conferences like this are a big part of that, but the flow is just so important. The space is moving so quickly, and the work that all of your companies do is just so fundamental to the world economy and all of our, well, society at large, that continuing a dialogue as part of the flow is kind of top of mind. Thank you so much. I hope that sets kind of a landscape for the rest of the conference, and I'll be around for the next 2 days, and I'm really eager to engage with any and all of you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you.